First of all, thank you all for joining. I actually am a big fan of this book. After I met Daniel and spoke with him last week, I think it was, I bought the book on Amazon, and I am actually very, uh, I love history, but this was totally different way of learning history through the letters of his father. But before we talk about the book, I want to talk about Daniel himself. Daniel Chertoff, first of all, is joining us from Israel, Jerusalem, Israel, right now. It's late in the evening. It's a nice thing that they changed the clock this past weekend, so it made it 1 hour earlier for him. But he worked in the investment industry in both the United States and Israel. He was an analyst at Sanford Bernstein, where he followed the computer industry. He and his family moved to Israel in 1988, where he followed Israeli high tech and helped bring a number of companies public in the United States. Daniel was a venture capitalist and financial communications counsel to many publicly traded Israeli high tech companies. He retired early to study English literature at Hebrew University and was happily writing his doctoral dissertation when he discovered his father's letters. He is still involved in academia and is an associate editor of Partial Answers, which is an academic journal of literature and the history of ideas. And if you didn't meet Daniel's wife a little bit earlier when she said hello, his wife's name is Arlene. They live in Jerusalem. But I do want to talk about the book for a moment. And of course, Daniel will fill in many of the other blanks about his book. I love history. If you go to any Jewish school, you've learned about the origins and the fight for the state of Israel, but I truly have never read it and studied it and learned it the way I read it through Daniel's father's letters. And his book, as you'll learn, is really letters from his father who was in Israel. He was in Israel writing to his parents and his siblings what was going on. It's truly a fascinating read that I recommend. If you are a Kindle reader, then you'll save a little bit of money by purchasing it for your Kindle. But it is an extensive book. I thought, I have to tell Daniel, I was going to tell you this. When I looked at it, it's a paperback. When you look at it, I thought it was going to be 100, 200 pages. It's 400 pages, and it really gives you a good knowledge of what was going on in Israel from his father's perspective, but also filling in the blanks of the history of what truly was going on, so you don't get lost because maybe there was a gap from letters. I really liked it. I do recommend it. I wasn't asked to give a review of the book, but I truly appreciated the book and the letters that were in it. I'm going to turn the mic over to Daniel. And again, after his presentation, you will be able to ask any question that you have of Daniel. So thank you, Daniel, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating. I'm very grateful to Rabbi Lerov for organizing and hosting this event. I'm once again going to give a shout out to two old friends who are on the call, Linny and Shelley, who I've known since I'm 8 years old. So I'm very happy that they're joining us. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share select episodes in the most important event in Jewish history in 2,000 years, Israel's War of Independence and the reestablishment of the state. So let me first set up my presentation so you'll have something to do rather than just listening to my voice. Okay, I hope everyone can see it. Great. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about finding the letters, something that helped me understand how personal Jewish history is. My father was Mordecai Chertoff, and he was the foreign news editor and war correspondent for the Palestine Post during Israel's War of Independence, which I'm sure all of you know was from 1947 to 1949. And he was also a soldier in the Haganah, which was Israel's army at the time. Now, as a kid, I grew up hearing his stories about the war and about his time there, and I was basically pretty tired of them. Still, I encouraged my father to develop his stories into a memoir of the period, which I then edited and produced. The memoirs were based on newspaper clippings and his memory, and they were very anecdotal and a little bit random. But he never said anything to me about letters. It was only when he died that I found a large cache of letters, mostly those that he had written from Jerusalem to his parents and his siblings in the US, and their responses. He and his family had saved all the letters. So at first I thought, well, I'll just scan them in case my children are interested. But then I started to read them and I found myself absolutely captivated. First of all, I was excited by the opportunity to learn more about Israel's War of Independence. I've lived in Israel now for over 32 years, and I live with the conflict with the Palestinians, and I thought maybe understanding the war would help me understand the conflict better. And I was curious, how would his version of history compare to history books? And what is history now anyway? How do we deal with personal eyewitness contemporaneous narratives in our ideological post-historical age? Israeli historian Anita Shapiro writes that autobiographical writing is an attempt to give expression to that fleeting moment, to freeze time, to perpetuate what happened in real time before the historians and writers and agents of memory expropriate the past and control its shaping. Well, we live at a time when there's no such thing as truth. All narratives, no matter how ludicrous, are equal. But I had extraordinary material and I couldn't wait to dive in. But then there are the personal aspects. What would it be like to get to know my father as a young man? Novelist Ian McEwan writes, who wouldn't want to travel back in time and encounter their parents before they became their parents? Indeed, what an opportunity. Well, I discovered that my father had proposed to a woman, not my mother. And while waiting for her answer, he was apparently very close with another woman, and he had his eyes on a third. My mother wouldn't enter the picture for another 3 years. In any case, I found all three of these women, or their descendants, as well as descendants of other important people discussed in the correspondence. And I'm going to share with you stories about two of them, quite extraordinary. So I took these strands, the historical, the personal, the communal, and I put them all in their historical context and I wove them together into a book. This is not a memoir with its embellishments and corrections of dimly remembered experience. Contemporaneous letters are raw and honest, spontaneous accounts of events. So what I'd like to do is to share excerpts from 4 letters describing 4 specific historic events. Specifically, the vote for partition, which established the legal basis for the State of Israel, the siege of Jerusalem, the bombing of the Palestine posts, in which he was present, and then being embedded with the Palmach and discovering the Burma Road, which relieved the siege of Jerusalem. And I'm going to conclude with just a few short thoughts on memory in Jewish history. But first, I think we need to have just a very general outline of the war so that we're all on the same page. Now, most historians would say that the war began, if I can find here's my cursor, began here. The conventional war began on the 15th of May, 1948, right after Ben-Gurion declared the state and 5 Arab countries invaded. But I think it actually began earlier with the Balfour Declaration of the British in 1917. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. So I'm sure you all know that in the aftermath of World War I, the British were awarded the mandate to administer the Palestine district of the Ottoman Empire, and specifically to implement the Balfour Declaration. It's hard to exaggerate how widespread the support was for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine and for the return of Jews to their homeland. So the British administered Palestine from about 1920 till about 1948. Now, beginning with the partition plan on November 29th, the Civil War began. And this was the period of the war between the local Arab and local Jewish populations. Then, when Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of the state, the conventional war began. And that lasted really until armistice agreements were signed in July of 1948. Okay, so with that really bare bones structure, we can focus in on just a few events. My father moved from New York to Palestine in early February of 1947 when he was 25, and he quickly got a job at the Palestine Post. And a month later, here he is. He's the guy smoking the cigarette, standing in front of Gershon Agronsky, who later became the mayor of Jerusalem. Shortly after he joined the Post, he was recruited into the Haganah, Israel's secret and illegal army. Now, during that first year he was there, 47, he wrote a lot of letters home describing the illegal immigration of Jewish refugees from Europe and various other chapters in British Mandate history. In the spring of 47, the UN sent a fact-finding delegation, UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, to analyze the situation and to come up with a plan. Well, my father traveled with them throughout the Middle East, and he reported on their progress. Their final recommendation was to partition what was left of Palestine, that's after carving out Jordan, and on November 29, 1947, after some modifications, the UN voted to partition Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish countries. Now, the event was greeted by the Jews of Palestine with great, great happiness and rejoicing. My father wrote a long description of the night of the UN vote and the following day. He wrote it in Hebrew and apparently in a single sitting. It's filled with biblical and Talmudic allusions. This is part of what the original letter looked like. My daughter Rachel translated it. It's very long and it's very rich, but we're very limited in time, so I'm going to share with you just a few excerpts. The letter begins here, Uvechein vayihi b'chatzi halayla v'yavo l'Tzion goel. And it came to pass at midnight, and a Redeemer has come unto Zion. My dear family, Friday afternoon before Shabbat, we sat crowded together and fearful around our huge radio in the newspaper office, and we heard the proposal to postpone the vote. Our eyes dimmed and our blood froze in our veins. We walked through the silent and sad streets of Jerusalem and found no comfort. We envisioned military posts at every corner and machine guns, explosions and sirens, the terror and suffering renewed. Then comes a clear Shabbat morning under the scalding sun, and the people walk about with some sort of hope and prayer on their lips, and they stream to the western wall to pray with the chief rabbis. Friends on the street and in the cafes ask me, the journalist, how the debate will end. What will the night bring? And I answer their prayers with a quiet, Yeh beseder, it'll be okay. Dr. Arancha, the Secretary General of the General Assembly, begins, and the delegate from Lebanon speaks, and another, and yet another after that. And then Gromyko of Russia, hero of the Hebrew state, demands a vote. And suddenly, amid all the chaos, the chairman announces a vote not regarding the proposal to delay, but on partition itself. We sat glued to our seats, each of us with a piece of paper to calculate the prophecy, and pen in hand, and then alluding to the Yom Kippur liturgy, my father writes, and thus he would count, 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 33, the needed 2/3 vote. A great joyous cry, and then silence. The silence of the moment we've waited for 2,000 years. And in the narrow smoke-filled room, heavy with tension and oppressive concern, one long sigh of relief, a silent Mazal Tov from the depths of the heart. We left the room, each to his work, and within 15 minutes, the first paper went to print. Blessed are we who live at this time and stand in the Holy Land at the time of the great declaration. We embrace with tears of joy glimmering in each eye. Jerusalem, dead and deserted at night, by 10 was resurrected. We heard a tremendous roar from Ben Yehuda Street, David Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayam, and the roar is repeated again and again from the throats of the youth of Jerusalem, banding together in a huge hora around an armored police car. I left the office with a young woman who had come to hear the news with me, and we raced up the street. We ran and danced and ran and laughed, and cried interchangeably without even noticing our tears. We got on a large truck with a great crowd, and we were like grains of sand, people swarming towards the Jewish agency buildings. One young man with a trumpet walked the entire city, and people followed him. Suddenly, the blue and white flag appeared on the balcony, and a jubilant and fresh Hatikva, which we had never dared to hope for and never anticipated, erupted from 5,000 mouths. And after that, Golda, 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 and she appears and speaks simply and touchingly. One old man, tears streaming down, covering his face, and disappearing into his white beard, mutters to a 6 or 7-year-old grandson, "Remember this, remember. This is what I waited 40 years for." Tears and laughter intertwine. We realize the reason the vote was delayed from Friday until after Shabbat, because the Moshiach doesn't come on the Sabbath. The people of Israel dwell in the land once more, and we are the last generation of slavery and the first generation of redemption. Now, 24 hours after the birth of the state, I sit writing in my office, waiting to finish the second edition, and it's as if a lump is stuck in my throat. And I fear I will burst into tears at any moment, unseemly for a hard-hearted journalist. And we've already paid with our first victims, 7 Jews murdered today. But who knows how great the number will grow until the day of peace will come to us. But there are no doubts whatsoever. Anyone who heard the Ani Ma'amin, the I believe, of the celebrating people and saw the people striding through the streets of Jerusalem does not fear what is to come. Truly, everything will be okay. Soon I go to bed after 2 days without any sleep at all, but I'm not tired. This great miracle stands before me and robs me of sleep. We must be worthy of it. Good night, with much love and great and blinding joy, Mordecai Shmuel. I've read it more than once, and I still find it very difficult to get through. So, Jews have an historical consciousness. We're never satisfied with simply telling a story. We often have to reenact it. Think about Pesach, when we all sit around the Seder and reenact leaving Egypt, or receiving the Torah on Shavuot, or Sukkot, where we camp in the desert to imagine what it was like for the children of Israel in the desert. This is how history is truly inculcated. So having a vivid eyewitness account helps us who weren't there to experience an incredible event. Now, as I mentioned before, the vote for partition was like the starting bell for the Civil War. And since it was illegal for Jews to have arms or even an army, it was very difficult for the Jews to defend themselves. The Arabs put the Jewish parts of Jerusalem under siege in an effort to starve it into surrender. They even cut off the water supplies. Now, as the siege deepened, there were increasing attacks on convoys attempting to bring supplies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The city was starving. In January 1948, it took 30 trucks per day to supply Jerusalem, but by March, there were none. On January 19th, a convoy going from Kibbutz Ma'alei HaChamisha to Jerusalem was attacked. 3 Jews were killed and many were wounded. The New York Times mentions the attack, but only in the context of their story on punitive action taken by the Zionists. One of my father's closest friends in Palestine was a young woman from Ohio named Anne Strauss. She was the secretary of Dr. Chaim Yaski, who was the head of Hadassah Hospital, and she had a boyfriend. Alter Chaim Rechnitz was born in 1914 in Poland, and he lost his entire family in the Holocaust. He made it to Palestine and was a founding member of his kibbutz. He was a farmer, but well known for a strong aesthetic sense. My father wrote about their relationship, and he described the attack on their convoy in a tribute he wrote to them. I'm going to share a few sentences from the tribute. Alter's chofesh, his vacation from the kibbutz, was due, and so on Sunday morning they climbed into one of the 3 trucks which made up the convoy and found seats for themselves among the crates of fruit and cans of milk the kibbutz was sending to Jerusalem. It was a bright, dry winter's day, a winter chamsin, or a hot spell, which burns all the cold and dampness out of one's bones and erases all memory of the rain and the mud and Jerusalem's hailstorms. It was a clear day, and the attacking Arabs were in full view as they shot at the convoy from the hills. The driver of the truck they were in was hit and lost control of his vehicle, which skidded into a ditch, breaking the ropes, holding the freight, and sending it all into a heap on top of the hidden arms. With the first shots, he pushed her from her precarious seat and stretched out across her body, trying to shield her from the shots. He saved her life and gave his own. He was hit in the head and chest and was dead when Magen David Adom picked him up and put him on a stretcher. She only knew that he had been hit. She felt his hot blood soaking through her clothing as she lay there on the floor of the truck. She was still pleading to see him and asking how badly he was hurt when an injection put her to sleep, and she too was taken from the first aid building to Hadassah Hospital. She'll be told all too soon. A young man died a hero's death, but that is a very small consolation to the girl who loved him. Now, if you've ever driven from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you may have noticed the old burned out armored cars along the side of the road. Those are memorials to just these convoys. But let me bring you up to date. Anne Strauss eventually married, and I found her son, Roe. He's about my age. I asked him for more details about the attack, but he had no details. He knew it would happen. He knew it had happened because it's an historic event, but like many Holocaust survivors, his mother absolutely refused to discuss it. She wouldn't give him any details. So when he and I got together, I read him my father's detailed account. It filled in many details that he didn't know anything about. We discussed it, we shared photos of our parents, and we cried together. Now, he told me that Dr. Yasky, her boss, was murdered a few months later, on April 13th, in the famous attack on the doctor's convoy. This was a weekly convoy between Hadassah Hospital on French Hill, which was an island in other words, Arab Sea, with the city center of Jerusalem. 81 Jewish medical personnel were massacred. Now, Roe told me that his mother was supposed to have accompanied Dr. Yasky, but he asked her to stay back in the office and finish some paperwork. This, without a doubt, saved her life. I just mentioned also that Anne studied geology and later became a very, very useful interpreter of aerial photography for the Haganah. Now, less than 2 weeks later, it was my father's turn. On February 2nd, the Palestine Post was bombed. He was in the building when the bomb went off. I want to share with you a 1-minute newsreel clip of how the British covered it. This is long before social media and long before network news. So it's 1 minute long.
From Jerusalem come pictures of the latest outrage. This time it's understood to be the result of a bomb placed by Arab terrorists. The offices of the Palestine Post, the Zionist daily published in English, were partly demolished and set on fire. A score of people were injured, and the flames, which spread rapidly, not only made rescue difficult, but also gave the firefighters a very tough job. The fire raged for several hours, and after it had been dealt with, the street soon had all the appearance of an evacuation. Property which had been salvaged littered the pavements, for a block of flats in this Jewish quarter of the old city had also been involved in the conflagration.
Well, my father wrote a 4,500-word description of the event, perhaps the most detailed eyewitness account of exactly what happened that night. It is absolutely gripping, but it's far too long to read in its entirety. But I'm going to share a few selections with you, and I want to tell you a very, very interesting personal story that's surrounding this event. Dear everybody, One of the boys was walking along Prince Mary Avenue Sunday night when he heard a terrific explosion. Somebody shouted out from a police armored car, "Well, that's the end of the bloody Palestine post." There was a burst of laughter. The voice was wrong. Somebody dashed over to Haganah headquarters and reported that 100 people had been killed. Miraculously, he too was wrong. I'd been sitting in the newsroom at the time. I ran down to the press and in the dark saw a figure sitting on the floor. I called in, "Mise, who is it?" And the fellow with whom I work and next to whom I invariably stand at 11 o'clock answered. I ripped down a door to make a path for us. I saw he needed help, but how much I couldn't tell, and I rushed in. Having recognized my voice, he kept moaning, "Mordecai, kach oti lemagen David." Take me to the aid station. I grabbed him by the shoulders and held him while I yelled for a stretcher. Hugh Orgill of our foreign news staff came by, and together we got Robbie onto the stretcher and carried him the 100 yards or so to the clinic and up a flight of steps into the aid room. Then we ran back and I draped someone else's arm around my shoulders and dragged him away too. During the first few minutes of the rescue work, we were shot out from behind the clinic, and one hit an ambulance which burst into flames. In the clinic itself, all the windows had been shattered and some doors had been ripped off, and with debris all around them, the doctors and nurse went to work like automatons. One of them grabbed me and we brought Shimshon, one another of our makeup men, from the aid station to the operating room. He too recognized my voice and kept telling me he was cold. I explained that he was wet, but I couldn't tell him it was his own blood all over him. By the light of 2 burning buildings, I saw a street which looked like blitzed London. Pieces of wall of balconies, clothing and a child's doll and shutters were scattered all about. The body of the truck which had brought the explosive was blown across the street in one direction, and its motor sat in a crater alongside the building. As I walked away, I heard another English soldier say, "Well, I guess it'll be weeks now before the post comes out again." I didn't like his tone, so I snapped at him, "Not even days. We'll be out tomorrow if we have to write it out by longhand." And then I ran up towards the Café Atara. Someone said, "Go over to the Lipschitz printing shop. They're trying to put out a newspaper." With one linotype machine, we went to work. A dozen correspondents brought typewriters. Everyone pitched in, and half asleep on our feet, we got a newspaper together. At 6 in the morning, the Palestine Post appeared. Smaller than usual, but it appeared. And for the morale of the yeshuv, it was a great thing. People couldn't believe it, and it was too much. To produce a paper from memory starting at 1:30 in the morning, after the hell that we'd been through, it bordered on the miraculous. But we did it. There were people in Jerusalem who didn't know that the Post had been destroyed until they read about it in the Post. One of the linotypers died the following morning. The man I carried in, Robbie, is on the border as I write. If he lives, his 3 beautiful little children, whom he used to run with in Rechavia, on sunny Shabbat afternoons will have a blind father. You can appreciate what a tragedy blindness would be to him. Hasolel Street is digging itself out. Stores are back in business while repair work goes on. One bookshop, Atid, advertised, "More open than usual," and kept going even without one day off for repairs. Now, 2 days later, my father wrote a follow-up with many more details. Among them, "Robbie, my favorite down in the press, will live. I understand there's even a chance for one of his eyes." Well, unfortunately, my father was wrong. His favorite pressman, Robbie, eventually did succumb to his wounds. The youngest of Robbie's 3 beautiful children is a man named David Nevo, who never knew his father. He was too young when his father died. Today, David is a very successful high-tech and defense industry executive, but he's a bit obsessed with the bombing. He spent a lot of time researching it and interviewing people, but like Roi, he had very few details. Suddenly, I show up, a stranger, with an eyewitness account written by someone who loved his father, pulled him out of the rubble, and probably bought him his last year of life. I think you can imagine what it was like for David Nevo and I to sit together, share information, and think about the fact that our fathers worked together for quite a while and that my father was instrumental in pulling him out of the rubble. Now, 3.5 months later, on May 14th, David Ben-Gurion formally declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Almost immediately, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria all attacked, and the conventional war began. But this time, there are no rousing letters describing the declaration. For one thing, there was virtually no mail service. For another, no one had any time to breathe. A year later, after the declaration, my father wrote a description. I'll read you just a couple of sentences. Jerusalem did not celebrate the declaration of the state. There were no parades and no banquets. All manpower not essential to the city's vital industries had been mobilized. There was little enough food in the city to keep real hunger away, let alone for celebration. After all, Jerusalem had already been at war for 4.5 months. There was no food and no water beyond the pails full doled out by truck under fire. Jerusalem was a desolate city, bristling with roadblocks and dragon's teeth. Jerusalem was a tent city. Every Jew in the city was alerted. Men were lined up and ready to fight. Well, less than a week after the declaration of the state, on May 20th, my father wrote an article describing how the Palmach, that's Israel's elite commando unit, took the Zion Gate entrance to the old city of Jerusalem. As a result, the Palmach, which was very pleased with the article, adopted him. They also adopted Azaria Rappaport, who was the war correspondent for Haaretz, and they invited the two men to travel with them. This is a very early example of journalists being embedded. My father loved the Palmach, and he reported extensively on their exploits. In a letter to his parents, he wrote, "Let me tell you something about my unit, Haportzim. They're heroes, every last one of them. I would obey an order from their lowest officer. They value each life very highly. The result is that every job is well planned and carefully executed and almost invariably successful. You can't imagine how proud I am that they've taken me in and see fit to consider me okay." Last night, Azaria and I were given a note by Yitzhak Rabin, the 27-year-old commander for the Jerusalem sector, saying simply, "Take these two men to Tel Aviv, they're okay, and they help us." Well, I think you'll recognize the name Yitzhak Rabin. In fact, we are currently noting the anniversary of his assassination, formally next week, but there have already been a lot of tributes and ceremonies already this week. But this note, which the future prime minister gave my father, allowed him to participate in one of the most dramatic stories of the War of Independence, the creation of the Burma Road, the road which broke the siege of Jerusalem. Now, if you recall earlier, we talked about the attacks on convoys trying to bring food and arms to Jerusalem, like the one in which Anne was wounded and Alter was killed. As we said, by March of 48, no convoys were able to get through. In addition, the Arabs had cut off the water supply, leaving only what remained in cisterns in Jerusalem. Now, the governor of Jerusalem, Dov Yosef, did an incredible job managing the crisis. He organized the rationing of food and water, and even arranged activities for the residents of Jerusalem to keep them occupied. Now, the Jews had made many, many attempts to open the road and to break the siege, including military operations Nachshon, Harel, Yevusi, and Maccabi. But let me explain the problem. This is a map. This is the road, if you can see my pointer. This is the road to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, but it passes underneath Latrun. Now, within Latrun, there is a fortress called the Castel, and this had control over the road. Now, this area changed hands many times between the Jordanians and the Jews, but it remained a problem. Ben-Gurion understood how devastating the fall of Jerusalem would be. He said, "If the land of Israel is the heart of the Jewish nation, then Jerusalem is the heart of hearts." There had to be a way to avoid this stretch of road. Ben-Gurion ordered the army to find an alternative route. Now, my father wrote a long and exciting account of finding and the development of the road. The article begins, "It began with 3 men on foot moving down through the Judean hills in the darkness to the thunder of cannon and the crack of rifles at Latrun. The 3 men were picked from Palmach's Hapotzim unit, the unit which had learned every inch of the way during the original road clearing operations, Nachshon and Maccabi. My father was at the base camp from which the men set out." Now, let me show you what happened. This is the route they found. It's really little more than a path. And the problem is that right here in the middle, it was very, very steep. So trucks could come in only so far, and they would have to unload their cargo, which would then be carried by porters across the steep part to the other side, where trucks from Tel Aviv would carry on the rest of the way up to Jerusalem. Now, during this period, volunteers were working frantically to make the steep portion navigable for trucks to connect up the 2 sections. I'm sure you've all seen the movie Exodus, where this is very dramatically portrayed. Now, they show the Jeeps slipping, and so that was the Burma Road. The work had to include also laying a pipeline for water, and all of this was finally completed by June 10th. Now, there are many fascinating twists and turns in the story, but we don't have time to discuss them in detail. I'll just tell you that my father's account ends like this. 3 men went walking on a cloudy summer's night down the hills of Judea, and the siege of Jerusalem was broken. Jerusalem has its own lifeline to the coast. Well, the Burma Road is a wonderful hike next time any of you get to come to Israel. Oops, sorry. Now, by the summer of 1948, my father was in the army full-time. Look at him in his snazzy uniform. He's quite the gever, the hunk, mostly in intelligence jobs, and he had no time to write for the Post anymore. The last assignment he had was to edit a magazine for English-speaking volunteers. Okay, that's it, but I want to bring you up to date on his personal chronology. After the war, my father took up a position as a press officer where he met my English mother. Now, this is my mother. She had been in the British Navy in World War II, and after the war went to Marseille to look for survivors from her family. She said that all the good-looking Jewish guys were going to Palestine, so she got on a boat and also went to Palestine, where she met my father. The 2 of them moved to the US, supposed to be temporary, but of course it became permanent. My father in the US was a pulpit rabbi, and then he worked for various Zionist organizations in New York until I brought him back to Israel for the last 6 years of his life. Now, I never got a really good answer as to why he left Israel, but I have my own ideas, and I explore it at some length in the last chapter of my book. Nevertheless, his whole life was totally dedicated to Israel. And at this point, one of his children, 3 of his grandchildren, all of whom served in the army, their spouses, and 8 great-grandchildren all live in Israel. So even if my father didn't live most of his life in Israel, he did leave a strong Zionist legacy, as well as a pretty interesting account of a really important period in Israel's history. I just want to finish with just a couple of brief thoughts about history and memory, because for Jews, the 2 are completely intertwined. The philosopher David Hartman writes, "Parents provide their children with luggage. Whether they open this luggage in the future and use its contents is beyond the knowledge and control of their parents." Well, my father obviously left me a hell of a suitcase, filled with history, stories, incredible people, and artifacts. I've not only opened it, but I've pretty much internalized his memories. finding the letters, writing the book, researching the book has had a huge impact on me, but not just on me. The events he describes turn out to be really important to Roy Shenkar, David Naveau, and many other people who I haven't told you about. But these stories belong to you as well. Everyone on this phone call has an interest and stake in the history. Every Jew in the world has an interesting story about where he or she comes from. And all of these stories are really interesting and important. This how and why of individuals, this is the story of our people. Okay, enough. I've spoken long enough. I'd be very happy to take any questions. Let me just unshare the screen. Okay.
First of all, thank you very much. And I just put into the chat if anyone wants to find the if anyone wants to find that book on Amazon, just an easy link for it. But your first question is actually coming from the chat, and that is from your friend Al. Why was it called the Burma Road?
Oh, that's a great question. It was called the Burma Road because one of the engineers who was instrumental in working on it, a guy named Colonel Trotter, had been recruited to come to Palestine and help build the road. He had built the original road, or one of the roads used during World War II to go through Burma to circumvent the Japanese. So the road originally was called the Burma Road. Then it was called Road 7, which was the Harel Brigade that had actually found it. But I want to tell you that I only know about Colonel Trotter because his daughter lives on Kibbutz Mavo Chama, where my cousin lives, and I was able to hear the story more directly. But that's the connection.
And then you had another question in the chat. And again, for those of you who would like to verbalize your question, feel free to. Or Al, if you had a follow-up to that, feel free to unmute and just let us know. Audrey is asking, did Mickey Marcus help with the road to Jerusalem? And did Mickey Marcus help in the road to Jerusalem? That's
yes, Mickey Marcus was definitely a big part of this. His role is very controversial and it was a bit brief. My father does mention Colonel Marcus. You may know that he was recruited to come to Palestine and try to instill some discipline into the Israeli army, the Haganah, which was a very loosey-goosey kind of organization. He died under very mysterious circumstances. The story is that he didn't know the password and was accidentally shot by a sentry. My father contributes to the conspiracy stories, and in one of his letters tells his parents it isn't completely clear that his death was an accident. There were Haganah officers who were somewhat resentful of his being involved, but I personally don't have a point of view. I would find it far-fetched because Marcus did make an important contribution, and he was definitely part of that whole story of the Burma Road.
By the way, I think you mentioned that in the book about the conspiracy theory part to that.
I included that part of my father's letters.
Right. No, I'm saying I think maybe it's a footnote that you write that it's a conspiracy theory. All right, next question. Well, first of all, when did the Palestine Post become the Jerusalem Post? That's the question.
If I'm remembering correctly, the Post was created in 1932, and I think it's 56 that it became the Jerusalem Post. But I have a great story I want to tell you. This reminds me. Just after I started talking about my book, I had a business card made called Palestine Posts, which is the name of the book. And my wife and I were traveling, and we were sitting on the airplane to go home from the States. And the head of LL Security comes over to me and says, "We have a few more questions for you. What do you have to do with Palestine? And why does it say Palestine on your luggage tag? And have you ever been to Arab countries?" And she starts grilling me about my book, about what connection I have with Palestine. And I explained to her, well, it's just named after the newspaper. It was the Jerusalem Post. It used to be the Jerusalem Post used to be called the Palestine Post. And we're talking about a 25-year-old young officer who obviously didn't know enough about Jewish history. And we were getting nervous. At first it was funny. And then my wife and I were getting nervous that they were going to throw us off the plane. Finally, one of the flight attendants comes over and says to her, for God's sakes, the guy wrote a book about, his father in the war. His father was a soldier in the war, and he wrote for the Palestine Post. Like, it took her. Then I watched the light bulb go off, and I said, listen, next week I'm making a presentation in Jerusalem. Please come. I'd like to tell you more about this history. She obviously didn't know much, but people forget that before 67, the Palestinians were the Jews, and it was pejorative, originally a name given by the Romans, but we were the Palestinians. It's only much later, for political purposes, that they became the Palestinians and we became the Jews.
And actually, in your book, you write that your dad liked the Palestinian Jews more than the foreign Jews, and then maybe that switched on what he actually lived in the sense of socially. Another question, and this is really for a book group type of a question. Do you have a discussion guide for book groups? I didn't notice one in the book itself, but.
No, unfortunately, I don't. I think I recall writing out some questions that were requested by some organization. So I may have a list of questions. So if anyone is interested, let them ask through you, and
Okay.
I'd be happy to look for it and provide some
Okay, Ellen,
questions.
so you'll email me and I'll email Daniel.
Okay.
And then this is from Shoshi, who is Israeli, and she had mentioned she noticed that the names of the roads to Jerusalem are actually different than now.
Ah, well, good for her. Good for you, Shoshi. It used to, yes, they are different. I spent a lot of time looking for a map of Jerusalem during the British Mandate, and I didn't find that many. But Shlom Zion HaMalka Street was originally Princess Mary Avenue. The Palestine Post was on Rehov HaSolel, which then became Chavatzelet. And there was a whole process whereby so many of the British names of streets were converted and translated. And unfortunately, I cannot tell you how many hours I spent looking for a list or a press release or something, giving the correspondences of the different names. But it's really fascinating. And if anybody can find one, please share it with me, because I would really love to see it.
If Google doesn't have it, then we're stuck.
As I said, I found a tourist map, 1946, but it doesn't have enough detail to identify a lot of these names, especially in the eastern part of the city. King George was, I'm sorry, I don't, those are the only two that I know. And in fact, it took me quite a while to figure out where HaSolel Street was. And my father took me and my two sons on a tour of Jerusalem, pointing out the various events. We have some videos of him, some lovely excerpts of my father showing us some of these places. And at one point I said, Dad, where the hell is HaSolel Street? And he just laughed and he said, come. And he took us up, turned out to be Chavatzelet Street, and he showed us the plaque on the building that used to be the Palestine Post.
All right, another question. This is fascinating. I'm saying everything you've shared. This question is more on the, I'm going to do a quick question and then another one that's going to be a little bit more extensive on your end. Do you know whether your book could become an audiobook?
I don't know. That's a wonderful question. I don't know. I think it would, I'd love for that to be, but I don't know. And I've had a couple of inquiries about a Hebrew version. So all of that is uncertain at the moment.
Yeah, that would be great, the Hebrew version.
If there's a Hebrew version, it'll be an interesting problem, because the correspondence between my father and his father was all in Hebrew. Beautiful Hebrew, really beautiful Hebrew. So
you might have to
translate. It would be a little bit of a different, sorry?
You might even have to translate the Hebrew to a modern Hebrew. Is that what you're trying to say?
No. I would leave it. But they would have to be annotated, because there are so many Talmudic and biblical allusions. Neither one could put a sentence together without some reference. That's the way they thought. And they were very well educated, and they saw all of this in messianic terms.
Nice. All right, and then here's a question that was from
It's
Andrea.
interesting to me. That's more interesting than anything you said.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your mother?
My mother.
Yeah.
Well, my mother was British. Her family had escaped from Poland and got to England pretty early. She and her 3 siblings all served in the British Army, the British Armed Services. As I said, my mother was sent by her family to Marseille, which was the clearing area for refugees, looking for survivors of the family. Unfortunately, she didn't find any. She had worked in the film industry in England and had made a film with Sir Laurence Olivier. And when she got to Palestine, she got to Israel, it was already Israel by the time she arrived. She worked for Palestine Films Company and met a photographer named Ephraim Ilani, who then introduced her to Mordecai Chertoff. And they stayed there for a while. Then they went to London in '51 to get married. And my father promised her that they would stay in Israel, but he wanted to go back to the States for a long visit. Unfortunately, they never went back to Israel. And I grew up with stories about, oh, we're going to go back, we're going to go back, we're going to go back. But they never did. And then when Arlene and I told them that we were moving to Israel, my mother was shocked. What do you mean? Where does this come from? Why are you moving to Israel? And I had to laugh. I said, my whole life you programmed me for Aliyah, and now you're surprised that we're actually going to do it? She said, but you have children, so you're going to take my grandchildren away from me. I said, no problem. Come move to Israel with us. So she actually did come quite often. Unfortunately, I couldn't convince her to stay. I want to point out that one of the people on this call, well, Linny and Shelley, who I'm not sure is still with us, but Lynn's mother, Beverly, was my mother's dearest friend in the world, her best friend for many, 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 many years. So Pittsburgh had been a very important experience for us. And so I think Lynn knows my mother almost as well as I did.
And then Stan, did you have a question? I know that you unmuted your mic, Stan Nitsky.
No, I didn't have a question, but I unmuted my mic. We came in late. We had a problem with our computer, so we missed about the first 15 minutes.
I have it recorded. I'll share that with you.
Okay.
I had a question, Daniel. Knowing, I guess from some of your letters, not your letters, your dad's, you do see there's a lot of death going on, but he doesn't necessarily show the emotions in the sense of, I think it's sort of like a given that's, you just know that this is what's going on. People are fighting for Israel. Do you think that, does that, I guess, emotion change over time in the sense of Israel today as well? There's plenty of family members that are fighting wars that on all fronts, always happening. Does that emotion play a part in how the natural Israeli family views death and dying in the military?
Wow. That's a pretty sensitive issue in Israel, because once upon a time, everybody was frantic to serve. And if a young man had medical issues or couldn't serve, there was a little bit of a stigma. And there were some privileges accorded to veterans that were not accorded to others. Unfortunately, it has changed. Israel has gotten a little more polarized. There was a period, I would say probably prior to 2005, and I'll explain why in a second, where an increasing percentage of young people were less interested in serving. And we had one well-known character in Israel, a woman who's a model, who said, "What's so great about dying for your country?" And I think that she probably expressed the view of a number of people. But in 2005, Israel left Gaza. And what happened then was, after Gaza reverted to being a base for terrorism, a lot of the left wing in Israel disappeared and weakened. The argument that the Arabs were frantic to make peace, I wouldn't say was exposed as not true, because I think that there are many Arabs that do want to make peace. But I think the political dynamic changed quite a bit. And whereas once upon a time, left and right in Israel was divided between those who said, let's make peace with the Arabs, and those who didn't have faith, that divide has largely changed. The left-right divide in Israel now is more political, it's more social welfare. I think it's probably not an overgeneralization to say that still the religious it's very, very important to serve. I don't mean the ultra-Orthodox, I mean the religious Zionist. And there was a period when the left was expressing concern that the young officers in Israel's army were overwhelmingly religious. And that for the future, that meant that Israel's army was going to increasingly be religious, whereas it used to be overwhelmingly kibbutznik. So it is a changing and dynamic situation. Clearly, my children were raised as religious Zionists and all were in the army. And as far as I know, pretty much all of their friends were as well. So I think it remains a very important value. And young people still are very anxious to be combat soldiers and to really be in the best unit they're able to get into.
Okay, I won't follow up on that one. But I guess, so in today, do you think that if you publish this in Hebrew, it would change people? I think it's an important thing to remember the feeling of what it meant to become the state of Israel. And your dad's letters definitely portray that, the excitement, even the fighting, even though, like I said, it's missing some sort of like an emotion in the sense of the mourning as people's lives are lost. But it's like a given, this is what we're doing for our country to be the state of Israel. Do you think that putting this in Hebrew would play a part in people's?
Yes, I do. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons that I wrote the book is I had an implicit desire to move away from politics and just say, I want everybody to remember and to relive a period of no moral ambiguity. I mean, remember the context. We had just gone through World War II, 6 million Jews murdered, and 250,000 Jewish refugees wandering around Europe. Nobody would take them in. It's just mind-boggling to me. And during the time period of the British Mandate, the British, who after World War II were starving, they had rationing into the 50s, nevertheless invested in a naval blockade of Palestine to prevent Jews from trying to escape from Europe. And if I tell you that the British were resentful of those pesky and annoying Jews, imagine them insisting on running the blockade and trying to illegally get into Palestine when we said they're not allowed. They should go home. Of course, they had no home. So yes, I think there's no question that one of the reasons that I published the book is to remind people that there are periods where there is no moral ambiguity. I don't think there's anything questionable about the birth of the state of Israel. And at the time, I mean, the UN voted overwhelmingly. If the UN had to vote now for there to be a state of Israel or not, it was no doubt that they would vote against it. So I think that we, in our zeal for even-handedness and empathy, I think we sometimes lose some moral clarity. So I think it is important, and yes, I would like to publish it. I had support. I had access to the archives of the Haganah and the Palmach, and I know they would like to see the book in Hebrew as well. Lenny, I think you were waving your hand, so if you wanted to ask something, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
No, I just wanted to say Laila Tov.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's late here in Israel, and I know you have to go to sleep. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Well,
Okay.
are there any other questions for Daniel? And if you do have a question and you don't have to put it into the chat, you can definitely unmute your mic. And I guess while people are contemplating that, you mentioned your dad has never ever mentioned these letters to you.
Yeah. My father did never mention them. I'm not sure why. I think in my heart of hearts, I believe that he forgot about them. But there's a little part of me that likes to think that it was strategic, that he actually knew, he remembered the letters and decided to let me discover them. And the thing is, if I had known about the letters before, I would have read them. I would have asked him all kinds of questions, and that would have been the end of it. I would have scanned them to save them, and that would have been it. But I never would have done the research that I did. I never would have found David Naveau or Roy Shankar. I never would have been able to speak with the woman that he proposed to. I found her. I called her. It was incredible to me. You know, this woman answers. I said, "Hello, I'm trying to reach Hadassah Frisch." She says, "Well, this is Hadassah." I said, "Hello, Hadassah. My name is Daniel Chertoff. My father was Mordecai Chertoff." And there's this silence on the phone. I think she's either, God forbid, had a heart attack. So and then she blurts out, "Oh my God." And we start chatting. And she said, "You know, your father liked me." I said, "Hadassah, my father proposed to you." "Well, yes, he did, but, well, you know how it is." And Hadassah directed me to her brother, who lives in Jerusalem, and we've become very good friends. Hadassah's brother is a filmmaker, and he was the unit producer for Exodus. And he made some of the most seminal Israeli films, like Casablanca and others. So, you know, if I hadn't done all this research, I never would have discovered these people. The other thing is that this is a way of making Israeli history my own history. So being spoon-fed or reading Benny Morris's wonderful history of the war is useful for learning the contours and the outline, but it loses exactly what you talked about before, the emotions, the personal aspect, the dedication and commitment. And, you know, to hear from Roy about his mother analyzing aerial photography and not being with Dr. Yaski when he was murdered, you know, and losing her boyfriend. I mean, this is the human aspect. And I'll just mention to you that right now on Israeli TV, there is a dramatic series about the Yom Kippur War. And it doesn't focus on the strategic and the historic. It's the personal stories. My wife can't watch it. She watched a few minutes and started crying. But I feel an obligation to watch it because the history is very, very personal. So I think that by my father forcing me to, or allowing me to research the individuals in the letter, Israeli history has become much, much more alive to me.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go
Marilyn,
ahead.
I know Frisch. He lives a street away from me in Jerusalem.
Larry Frisch.
Larry Frisch, yes, yes. I know him very well.
So now you have a connection to this, to Daniel.
Larry is a wonderful human being. So you probably know Dolly as well.
Oh my God, we email all the time, Dolly and I.
Well, you have to mention to her that we've met.
I will send her an email and let her know. Yes, I've been to her house many times with Larry and her.
Daniel, I'm gonna take a couple more questions. I see a couple people open.
Daniel, I have a question.
Linda and then Charlie.
Okay, I have two questions. One is, did your dad ever write about the Irgunniks or only Haganah?
Linda, that's a wonderful and an important question.
Yeah.
The answer is he did write about them. In his letters, he writes very scathingly about them, and he takes several pot shots at Begin. My father's problem with them was he felt that they undermined the Haganah. and distracted from the war effort. Members of the Stern Gang rob banks to finance their operations, and in some cases killed Jews. But I will tell you that later in life, my father came to admire Ben-Gurion without end. So although in the book he says he calls Begin a demagogue, and he was at Kikart Zion hearing Begin's speech, and he writes critically about it. But I will tell you that later in life, my father felt that Begin was one of the men of great integrity, that his role was critically important. He came to admire him and the Irgun, and completely changed his mind.
Did
I
you
think,
know?
Daniel, in one of the letters, I think he's upset at your parents or someone who went to listen to Begin in the United States.
Yes,
So, yeah.
he yells at my grandmother for going to a fundraiser for Begin.
Did you know if he ever wrote about somebody called Ellie Blankfeld? Does that name ring a bell?
No, not that I recall.
No, okay. There's a park right opposite the American Embassy in Jerusalem dedicated to him.
Really?
He was, he's my Machatenista's father. That's why I'm asking.
I would just want to tell you that I've had several presentations in which relatives of Irgun members have been in touch. And it's lovely to hear their stories. I am fascinated by their stories. Of course, the most famous incident involving the Irgun was Deir Yassin, which I write about in my book. And my editor was trying to push me to the left on the story of Deir Yassin, saying, no, it was a massacre, it was a massacre. And I said, well, we don't know if it was a massacre. There's a contemporary Israeli historian named Eliezer Tauber who said, no, it wasn't a massacre. It was much more complicated. So I think some of the incidents for which the Irgun is blamed are not so simple, and I think we continue to learn more about them. In my book, I tried to avoid being partisan. I was just trying to report what was known, and in some cases updated my father because he was wrong about some things, because they simply didn't know at the time. But I think history is always a moving target, and we always learn more about it. And unfortunately, it also eventually is a political tool, which is why I try to stay out of that pit.
Yeah. One other question. What is the name of the series on Yom Kippur War? Because my husband fought in the tanks in that war on his way to Damascus. He was in Barak, the unit Barak.
Wow.
Do you know the name of the series?
Well, it's a series on Kan Echad, the first channel, and the first episode was called Sha'at Ne'ilah, which I think would be translated as closing time.
Nehila, no, okay.
Now I thought that was the name of the series, but I just watched the second episode before this event, and it was called Valley of Tears.
Okay, I will.
And it follows a tank unit up in the north, and it's excruciatingly painful.
It was.
And the tanks. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there is a book called Al Blima that has been written, 500 pages on that particular event. And the fact
I just want to jump in on, Linda, I want to jump in. Daniel,
sorry.
No, I Googled it quickly, and it says that HBO purchased the rights to it. So HBO? Look out for it. Look out for it on American.
Is there a title? I mean, what would I look for?
It's like Daniel said, Valley of Tears.
Oh, that's for the episode. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So I don't know that it's available yet to watch with
Probably
English subtitles or anything, but if you Google it right now, you'll see HBO purchased the rights on, this is very recent, October 14th.
Okay.
It just debuted a week ago.
Okay.
And I want to say one thing about it. The Tank Corps was the critical part of the October War, and they suffered tremendous casualties. And one of the most painful aspects of that was that there were soldiers that had tanks shot out from under them. the guys on the top were able to get out. The guys inside died.
Yes.
The guys on top jumped into other tanks.
Yes, exactly.
And then in many cases those tanks were later hit. So it took an excruciatingly long time to identify casualties, dead and wounded.
Yes.
So it's a war that is very painful to Israel. And I think it's good that we are now taking the opportunity to remember it. And I'm sure it will generate a lot of incremental research. And if your husband has memoirs.
He died 24 years ago, I'm afraid, here in California. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to hear it.
Thank you.
But that was an excruciating and critical event.
It was.
Thank you, Linda. I'm sorry to hear about your husband, but
Thank you.
I'm honored to hear about the event.
Yeah.
And then Charlie, did you have a question?
Yes. You were talking a few minutes ago about the feelings of the people in Israel toward the religious aspect of the feelings now in Israel toward veterans. How is the feeling toward the ultra-Orthodox? Their feeling is that their young people should not go into the military. What are the feelings there of those people toward being in the military?
Charlie, you've identified perhaps the single most sensitive point in Israel right now. It's a huge issue because originally Ben-Gurion said, we're going to exempt a small number of truly devoted Torah scholars. There were 400 of them in 1948. Unfortunately, he never really codified the situation. And so the numbers have grown, and there is a tradition for the ultra-Orthodox to be exempt from military service. Several years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that that was illegal and inappropriate, that everybody has to serve. The problem is that the ultra-Orthodox are the swing votes in the government. So they have a disproportionate say in the government. So the problem is that they have always managed to thwart legislation which says we want that everyone must serve. So it remains a sore. It remains a source of inequality in the same way that the ultra-Orthodox now, that some ultra-Orthodox are not social distancing and continue to attend services and go to yeshivot in violation of Israel's current coronavirus rules. Now, at the same time, I should say that there is a growing number of ultra-Orthodox that are working and paying taxes, and a growing number that are serving in the army. But it remains a very sensitive issue and something that really must be addressed. And I think that the COVID problem here is really exacerbating the situation and bringing the problem to a head. So I pray that some equitable solution will be found that brings the ultra-Orthodox more into the mainstream, rather than continues to generate a wedge between the ultra-Orthodox and the rest of Israeli society.
I think it's needed.
We all agree with you. I mean, they live in poverty and they have a high rate of infection because they live in poverty. They live in very close quarters. It's a very unhealthy situation, and the government has never really addressed it fully. It's time now. It's critical that it be addressed.
I hope they do it soon.
If Daniel had the answer to that one, he would be the prime minister.
Vote for me. Oh, please don't.
That was a good question, though. Any last final thought you want to share before we officially close?
It was wonderful. Fantastic
Thank you.
presentation.
Fantastic presentation is right.
Thank you. I really want to thank all of you. I have really never enjoyed an evening as much as I enjoyed this one. I really appreciate your participation and your attention. If you read my book, I'm reachable. I've had, you can always reach me through my website or through Rabbi Levertov. So I would love to hear from any of you. I love hearing, especially from people who have a connection. I managed to find, someone contacted me whose father, actually whose great uncle had been killed in the post bombing. These things are very serendipitous. So I hope it's the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So stay in touch.
Thank you. And again, thank you so much. This was most informative. And I personally, I like reading, and I've read books that just don't flow. His book really does flow. The letters all connect. It's not missing gaps. I think it was done real. I loved it. I thought it was done really well. And for me, it was, as much as I learned about Israel's beginnings, I don't think I've ever read it this way. I thought it was amazing. Thank you for all your efforts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Kol hakavod.
Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Stay well.
Okay.